Welcome to Hedge Tutor Tutorials. Introduction to Voluntary Carbon Markets. The release of greenhouse emissions from the beginning of industrialization has contributed to the increase of temperature of the Earth's surface, atmosphere and oceans. Global mean temperatures have increased above 1 degree Celsius in comparison to the baseline 1850 to 1900. The year 2020 and 2016 were the warmest. Global warming represents a significant impact on human lives and nature, causing more frequent droughts, heat waves, crop failures, climate change refugees, deaths caused by pollution, among some of the consequences. To avoid potential devastating global warming effects, 196 countries adopted the Paris Agreement in 2015, an international legally binding treaty on climate change limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius. To meet Paris Agreement goals, the public and private sector must work together, reducing greenhouse gases with medium and long-term strategies to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. To achieve carbon neutral goals, governments need to implement local regulations with emissions reduction targets, and at the same time, businesses are required to implement new technologies that reduce emissions, capture carbon, and replace fossil fuels consumption. For some sectors of the economy, there are no current technical or financial viable solutions to achieve carbon neutrality. In this case, carbon offsetting is part of the climate solution, helping countries and businesses meeting carbon reduction goals faster and more economically. What is net zero? Every CO2 ton released to the atmosphere must be matched by a CO2 ton removed from the atmosphere. Carbon offsetting means a company, government or individual investing in or buying carbon credits from emission reduction projects or carbon removals to balance their own emissions. Voluntary carbon markets enable the purchase of carbon offsets outside a compliance market to meet net zero targets or other environmental claims. The CO2 emissions reductions from a project compensate the CO2 produced elsewhere. The forest removes carbon from the atmosphere. Carbon offsets are registered. A company buys carbon offsets to compensate its residual emissions. A company may buy carbon offsets to meet net zero goals as per its sustainability plan in the absence of a mandatory obligation. Carbon offsets can be generated from emission avoidance and reductions or carbon capture and removals. Voluntary carbon markets have coexisted in parallel to compliance carbon markets. CO2 equivalent emission avoidance and reductions can be achieved, reducing or avoiding greenhouse gases via projects such as energy efficiency or displacement of fossil fuel generation with renewables. Carbon removals can be achieved capturing CO2 from the atmosphere through the implementation of new technologies or with nature-based solutions. Conservation, restoration of forests and oceans and improvement of land management. Annual global emissions are around 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. To achieve the Paris Agreement targets, the world needs to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Delaying the implementation of mitigation measures means higher concentrations of CO2 and higher costs of reducing emissions. Voluntary carbon markets are part of the solution, with demand for carbon offsets increasing to meet net zero goals and as delays in carbon neutrality targets occur. In the absence of a global mandatory carbon scheme, the voluntary carbon market offers an alternative solution to manage the demand and supply of carbon offsets, potentially prompting the convergence of the different existing carbon markets. An efficient VCM shall bring offset supply and demand together, reducing transaction costs and ensure the transparency and integrity of the transactions. As the demand of carbon offsets is expected to drastically increase to meet emission reduction targets, exchange-traded financial contracts can help building price transparency, creating arbitrage opportunities and developing price risk management tools to mitigate volatility. Hedging emissions price risk in exchanges and in the OTC market helps to secure finance for new projects. Comos, in collaboration with Keops Consulting, introduces Hedge Tutors VCM, voluntary carbon market subscription, an integral e-learning solution to develop a full understanding of the nascent voluntary carbon market and its associated financial derivatives traded on exchanges. The proposed learning experience comprises tutorials, case studies, and a simulation environment that allows the user to freely trade OTC products and associated financial contracts to understand the implications of price risk management and hedging.